It's not just a loose or empty demand when we say that we need trans justice safety. What we know that means is housing, employment, education, joy, hope, brilliance that we all deserve, whether it's here, on this stolen land, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's anywhere in this world. These are not empty demands. And I think that, this justice that we're calling for, unless it applies to everyone, then we're really asking for nothing.
Mutual, ba-la, mutual, ba-la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
Residents across Victoria and South Australia are being urged to remain vigilant as extreme fire conditions threaten both states.
Downgraded and lost cyclone status, 100km/h winds have torn roofs off homes and intense rainfall has swamped the region.
These are tough times, but Australians are tough people.
This podcast was produced on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge their continuing sovereignty and struggle for justice in this place. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This episode of the Radio Reversal podcast brings together a couple of interviews recorded over the last couple of months, digging into the targeting of trans people, especially trans kids, and moral panics about gender here and abroad. This is part of our ongoing series on crisis, colonialism, and collective futures, this time considering how this confected crisis about trans people and non-cis heteronormative and non-binary expressions of gender uses the tools of moral panic to justify dangerous, violent government actions. In so doing, this distracts attention from the actual crises facing trans young people and adults, including structural discrimination, violence, over-policing, barriers to accessing care, issues relating to housing, employment, education, and so on. As with other moral panics, the confected outrage is used to justify a set of draconian government actions that are authorised by this idea, this discourse, this feeling of crisis, and in the name of safety. In some instances, like here in so-called Queensland and the current ban on puberty-blocking medication for trans youth, this violent policy is being justified as being for the kids' own safety, for the protection of trans kids. This is, of course, laughable, given the overwhelming evidence that accessing gender-affirming care improves the safety and well-being of trans kids. But for those who don't know any better, denying kids access to this often life-saving care is rendered a kind of common sense. Just wait and see. What's the harm? In fact, there can be really significant harm in waiting and seeing. In other cases, as we discussed in the second interview in this episode, like in the recent case of the ruling in the UK that forces trans people, particularly trans women, to use single-sex segregated spaces for the gender they were assigned at birth. This is often done in the name of safety for cis women. Again, these are not evidence-supported concerns, right? Cis women are not made unsafe by the presence of trans women, and in fact, trans women are far more likely to be subjected to interpersonal violence and harm. And yet, the kind of confected crisis, the moral panic around these gender issues, this gender trouble, authorises these kinds of actions despite the very real harm they're going to cause trans people, and in the yawning absence of evidence that this is going to improve anyone's safety or well-being. In the first interview in this episode, Anna speaks with Necho Brocchi, proud trans woman and service delivery coordinator at Open Doors Youth Service. Anna and Necho have a big chat about the Queensland Government's ban on puberty blockers for trans kids that's resulted in hundreds of young people being denied safe and life-affirming medical care. Anna and Necho discuss the ban, how it ties into these moral panics around children and about gender, how and why it is possible to kind of to confect this moral panic and this truly disastrous ban, the kind of common sense in big inverted commas that these actions draw on and are based on. They explore the ways that the fight for trans justice and justice for trans young people is also intrinsically tied to other struggles for justice, including prison and police abolition, housing and educational justice, and justice for First Nations peoples here and everywhere. In the second interview, Han speaks with Wiradjuri and trans non-binary Professor Sandy O'Sullivan on a wider range of issues, but particularly reflecting on the recent Supreme Court decision in the UK that has significantly changed the lives of trans people living in that country. They talk about trans justice in medical settings, in healthcare. They talk about the importance of making room for complexity, for more capacious understandings of gender, of justice, of what this asks of us. Crucially, perhaps especially for this present moment, this present conjuncture, they also talk about backlash and about how progress is not inevitable. There's a kind of comfortable liberal myth, right, that things are bound to get better incrementally over time. And while it would be so lovely if that were the case, it's very, very evident that it simply is not true. That all wins, all gains for marginalised people have been fought for. They have been won, not just given, not just bestowed. They've all been fought for and they have all been won, and they all have to be defended. So I won't say any more. I'll let you get right into these two fantastic interviews, Anna with Necho Brocchi and Han with Prof. Sandy O'Sullivan.
We broadcast on the lands of the Turrbal, Yagara, Jagera, Yugarapul and Quandamooka peoples. We pay our respects to elders, past and present, and to all First Nations communities across the country. Sovereignty over these lands has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as we start with that reminder of where we are, we're also beginning with the reminder that it's not an empty slogan to say that our liberation is connected, that until all of us are free, none of us are free. When we say that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, we're saying that all Indigenous peoples across the globe deserve the return of their homelands, the restoration of Indigenous modes of governance and stewardship. We're saying free Palestine, free West Papua, free Kanaki. We're saying that the systems of exploitation and oppression that grew from European colonisation have taken root in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in every prison and watch house and immigration detention centre. They find expression in every moral panic about our queer and trans siblings, in every eviction notice handed out to a single mum who can't afford her fourth rent increase in 4 years. Our liberation is connected because these expressions, these oppressions are connected. Not the same, not even directly comparable sometimes, but connected. So that's where we begin this week, and always, with the connections between struggles and the people who are working to understand them, so we can tear it all down and imagine something better in its place. I'm Anna, and I'm so excited to be reversing the radio this morning with an absolute icon in our McGanjan's left scene. Necho, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm excited to be here and grateful to be here.
Necho, for anyone who hasn't heard you much on the radio before, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Necho Brocchi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a really proud trans woman. I'm a settler here in Mugginjan, and I've got my family's from Spain and Italy.
Queensland Government have instituted what they claim is a temporary ban on the prescription of what are colloquially called puberty blockers, particularly for people experiencing gender dysphoria. It's worth noting that they're not blocking the use of the medication for any other purposes, the many other medical reasons that people are prescribed these medications, but exclusively for people experiencing gender dysphoria. This announcement has been met with widespread condemnation from human rights groups, including the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Anna Cody, who said that the decision has the potential to harm the physical and mental well-being of children in Queensland. The Royal Australian College of General Practitioners said that the move would leave young trans people languishing in uncertainty and fear for their future.
I'm service delivery coordinator at Open Doors Youth Service, which is the only dedicated queer and trans youth service in this state. So we're currently supporting about 595 young queer and trans people. 89% of them are trans and gender diverse. So we see a lot of our young people really devastatingly impacted by this ban and this pause for a year. And I just always think that this is 491 people that are already 15 times more likely to suicide than their cisgender counterparts. This is 491 young people, 80% of them have self-harmed in this state. So it's not a potential to cause harm, it is causing harm. Every day at Open Doors we're receiving calls from families and from young people that have self-harmed the night before, that can't go to school, can't go to work because they're suicidal, and that they're devastated and they're heartbroken by this decision. And I think that everyone in our community and everyone in the broader community is really devastated and scared at this news, because this is a really awful time for our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the life and death stakes of it are really important, because that has been collapsed in a lot of the mainstream media coverage. There has been, I guess, a pretty inspiring response since the announcements, and we have seen, at least partly thanks to the work that Open Doors and other local orgs have been doing, a real outpouring of solidarity, including from sectors that we might not historically expect to be super supportive, but which does reflect the fact that this is also a medically negligent ban that's being installed. It's obviously politically horrific, which we'll talk about further in the show, but it's also medically unfounded and really dangerous. Even among the relatively conservative medical professions, people are very concerned at the implications of this. One of the things we wanted to talk about on the show today, Necho, is the way that this most recent set of heartbreaking decisions and the targeting of trans young people in Queensland is not really isolated from a much longer trajectory that we're kind of referring to as like the war on kids, that we've seen now over the last 2, 3, 4, 5, many years, a really active targeting and persecution of young people in Queensland. Before we kind of jump into the guts of the show, I wanted to ask, why do you think it's useful to see these most recent attacks on trans young people as connected to this kind of broader dynamic where we've seen young people targeted under the adult crime, adult time legislation, but also in multiple breaches of the Human Rights Act in 2023 and 2024, when the state government was looking to reform quote-unquote youth crime legislation? Why is it useful to see these as connected?
I think it's so important to see these as connected because this is an attack on all children and, of course, marginalised children and marginalised young people. And that, we see the adult time, adult crime, I'm sure like everywhere around this city, we saw those billboards. And I remember, keeping community safety before that, going into the watch houses and seeing overnight, all of a sudden, there was, filled in adult watch houses was young children. And that, seeing young children of this state banging on glass walls saying like, I want to leave here. What's going on, like that is a true testament to this system failing, is that if we have to lock up young people as young as 10 because they can't be with their family, their community, in our schools, where they deserve to be. And I think that if we track this, recent decisions for children, it's no surprise that they're banning this life-saving healthcare that actually, because it's about children's power and joy and hope and life. And so many times over the last couple of weeks, young people have said to me, I just want to live a life where, I'm able to go to school, I'm able to get a part-time job like everyone, but I'm also able to leave the house. I'm able to have hobbies. And I think that if this is about stripping agency and, children's future away from them, then of course this decision has happened. I think it's really important too to note that this question to me reveals that it's fundamentally young people's access to healthcare. I think that's really easily forgotten in this debate, and when it's used to win votes and it's used to run negative media stories on our community, but it's fundamentally young people's access to healthcare.
Yeah, and there's so many threads there already, Necho, that we'll dig into later in the show, but the way that I think it helps us also because it helps avoid the kind of siloing of these struggles, you know, so that when we're defending the rights of kids in Queensland, we're vigilant that we're defending the rights of all kids, you know, and when we stand up for trans rights, we're standing up for, you know, the trans young people who are also being victimised under adult crime, adult time, you know, when we're standing up for the rights of children to access life-saving medication, that also means the kids who are in watch houses, because they're not getting access to the kind of healthcare that they need, right?
And also directly is that, you know, this conversation is often spoken about as no longer access to, you know, life-saving, gender-affirming healthcare in hospitals, but prisons are state-run institutions, so any opportunity for young people to receive healthcare through that, if you're under 18, has now been gone. That's our understanding and what we've been told.
Yeah, it's absolutely shocking. We've watched over the last, actually many years, but particularly say the last decade, we've watched the anti-trans lobby really effectively create a moral panic about trans young people in particular, and one that incredibly disingenuously and very violently masquerades under a facade of concern and protection, you know, these kind of pseudo-medical ideas. People are just worried about, you know, trans young people's well-being. But I think this has been a really slow build, right? It's been kind of growing for decades in response, direct response to the increasing recognition of trans people's human rights. You know, the more access trans people get to any kind of justice, the more pushback there has been and the more vehement and violent the anti-trans lobby has been. So I reckon for a lot of our listeners, especially people who are mostly spending their time listening to, you know, queer and trans inclusive media and not necessarily reading mainstream media, this announcement, the temporary ban on puberty blockers, might have kind of seemed like it came out of nowhere, you know. But what does it feel like for you, working in the sector as a trans woman, someone who's kind of been living and breathing this for a long time? Were you surprised by this announcement?
So I wasn't surprised. I didn't think that it would happen so quickly. I didn't think that it would happen without community consultation. I didn't think that it would be statewide. I want to also highlight that just, you know, last year, a review into the gender service here in Mugginjin came back with glowing reviews that it, you know, administered world-class healthcare. And I think that that's really important to note in this time. I also think that, you know, speaking to sort of your question, is that it's so important in these moments to acknowledge that trans young people are 3% of the youth population, and that 1% of our trans and gender diverse community decide to detransition for multiple reasons, whether that's they've reached a part of their medical transition they're happy with, they want to maybe have a child, or they, you know, want to, stop that for multiple reasons. So I think when the mainstream media constantly comes at those two things, which is, you know, trans young people and detransitioners, I think that we all hold a real strong responsibility to actually present facts and say that we know that's 3% of the youth population, very small amount, and we know it's 1% of people that transition. And I think that, we have to put faces and stories behind this hate, you know, and really show people that, if you are going to make these policies that have such a negative impact and these bans, that it's young people, it's children's lives behind this.
I know there's probably most people listening, hopefully, have been listening to 4ZZ's coverage of this and maybe know a little bit more about it than the average person. But for anyone who doesn't know much about the medication that's being described here, what are puberty blockers? What are they used for? Like, why is the controversy around these particular drugs?
I think that's also highlights a really important thing, which is that we all have access to the internet and a lot of, you know, stories and information, but we also probably don't know exactly what puberty blockers do. And I want to also say I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving medical advice. What I've heard from community and, you know, had the absolute privilege of walking alongside people that have decided to take puberty blockers is that they're really well-researched medications. They've been researched and used for over 40 years. It's really important to note that they're used for a wide range of things, for children as young as 3 who have early onset puberty, who have also been really worried about this ban. And obviously they're used to prolong onset of puberty that might not be wanted if a young person is experiencing gender dysphoria. But it's also reversible, right? So you either decide to start taking your correct hormones or you decide to to let puberty run its course. And so I think that that's, they're really well researched, they're really long used, and they're reversible.
Yeah. I know that, and you've talked about this already, Necho, about the importance of being able to cut through the kind of dehumanising rhetoric of particularly mainstream media by humanising the stories, the actual young people who make up that 3% of young people who are trans. And I know Open Doors has been soliciting submissions and testimonies from young people since the announcement of the temporary ban. What can you tell us about the responses that you've gotten so far? What are the kind of key themes that have been coming out in that?
Well, I think this is so important to do, and the responsibility that we as a community organisation, community space have is to always centre young and trans and gender diverse people in this debate. And I think that what we're saying maybe that over and over again is that that's constantly lost. So I think the real goal of doing that is because we are presenting that to ministers. We are, making sure that everyone we have a conversation with in the last 3 weeks, everyone that we meet, we make sure that it's updated and we make sure that we're presenting them. We're also going to work with a trans photographer to take photographs, obviously de-identified, and make sure that we're really presenting all these ministers photographs of the people impacted, photographs of, the families that are devastated by this decision, and then also the stories. And what I really think the stories are revealing is that people are heartbroken by this. People have waited 2 years for that gender clinic. I know families that have waited since 2015, and then to be told overnight without no consultation that their child or themselves will no longer be, able to access puberty blockers or hormones. When they've written to the minister, they've been told, sorry, this is not your local member, please contact someone else. The parents and the young people need to be prioritised in this, because at the moment it definitely doesn't feel like that's happening. Yeah.
I really recommend listeners read through the testimonies. If you or if anyone has maybe been a little bit sucked in by some of the rhetoric around the apparent danger of these medications, I really recommend going to read some of the submissions that are on the Open Doors website, because and I think this really echoes the point you made right at the beginning, Necho, which is that these are not conversations about possible prospective future harms, right? These are conversations about young people who are currently experiencing harm that is profoundly exacerbated by this decision, and which will have life and death impacts on young people in this state. I think it's really important not to lose sight of that in the context of, the conversation that I am really interested in having, which is a conversation about the politics of this. What are they trying to do? Why this now? But I think it is crucial to always ground that conversation in the reminder that these are real people's lives, and this is a heartbreaking time for the community.
And, that's why we'll always be honest and say it's not a question of if, it's when. When will we lose people because of this? All in our community, we've all lost someone that, should have the healthcare, should have the support, but instead is isolated because of decisions like this. And that's devastating, and it's hard for that community.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of emphasise, I guess, to come to the politics of this a little bit more, because I think it is really useful as we try and kind of gather our tools to respond to, the anti-trans lobby, the kind of moral panics that are being orchestrated in this moment. It's useful to remember that they're doing this on purpose and they're finding ways, so I was really frustrated to realise that in the weeks after the announcement here in Queensland, the federal Labor government has also bowed to pressure from transphobic advocates, including former Prime Minister Tony Abbott and anti-trans campaigner Catherine Deves, who co-authored, with other people, an open letter calling for the federal government to launch an inquiry into puberty blockers and calling for all other states and territories to follow Queensland's lead in instituting bans on these medications. And in response to the open letter, the Labor government announced that they will be ordering a review of treatment options and guidelines for trans and gender diverse children. And I understand that this probably seems benign, surely if they order a review, it'll show that it's best medical practice and everything will be fine. But I think what it also shows is that the government is so quick to capitulate to pressure from the anti-trans lobby by accepting that there is something that needs reviewing, you know. And I think this is something that we need to pay close attention to, because it goes to the heart of this sort of production of a moral panic. Why do you think these moral panics seem to work to kind of convince so many people that life-saving, well-tested, medically necessary medications are dangerous or untested or threatening our kids?
I think the first sort of thing to note here is that as the Trans Justice Project has reminded us, that only 1 in 5 people in this continent, now known as Australia, have ever met a trans person. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about the politics of, anti-trans lobbies and how they've been able to operate here, is that it's very different if we're talking about sexuality, of our community. We're talking about lobbying against people who not many people know. So when I think all the threads that we've been talking about earlier of, humanity, faces behind it, access to healthcare, it's easy to strip that away when there's the fear of the unknown. And so we're speaking about 1 in 5 people have met a trans or gender diverse person. We're not at the point in our community where we can go out and get, safety in numbers, or that a lot of people know us, know our stories, know the absolute joy and strength and just brilliance of our community, know how our lives are not only saved but just affirmed and celebrated once we can access our basic healthcare. And I think it's not just ever about reaching an end line and saying, oh great, I got a puberty blocker. It was I was able to go to study what I wanted to do, or do have the community I wanted to do, because I'm able to live as who I am and be unapologetically free and authentic. And I think maybe another answer that I want to say too is if we look to recent history in the Weimar Republic and the first ever modern transgender surgeries, right in a time where our community started to get some rights and, maybe take a few steps forward, what directly came after that was Hitler. And I think this is also a reaction of us starting to be strong, to be firm in who we are. And of course that this is a real resistance and pushback against that. Like you said, that's been coming for a long time. But one thing I'm so hopeful for that the rally the other week highlighted is that we're not standing alone in this. We have solidarity from so many people in our community, and now more than ever we can ask ourselves, what is trans justice? What are the lives we want to live? And it's housing. We know something like 50% of young people don't have access to safe and secure housing once they transition. We know that mainstream schooling is not working for our young people. How can we make education actually accessible for trans and gender diverse young people? We know that we have very low rates of employment, of going to uni. So I think now we can really use this time too to ask, what is it that we're moving towards? And I think the solidarity is stronger than it's ever been.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is such a vital point that I think it is sometimes easy for those of us in a particular sort of bubble to forget that this is something that for a lot of people, the only access to any media about trans people or medication for trans people is mainstream media representations that continue to be largely dehumanising. The kind of pop cultural transformations in the past maybe 5 or 6 years, we might be seeing slightly more representation of trans people in pop culture. But as I know research by Prof Sandy O'Sullivan and others has suggested, those representations are a long way from filling any kind of meaningful space, where people might be meaningfully engaging with trans people, even through pop culture, through their TV screens or, the content that they're consuming.
And when is that representation made by us? I think that we're still a community that is so spoken for. I think that this time has told me there's no one or right way to respond, and they always want to tell that more progressive people, the left, are responsive. It's because we've got a lot to respond to, and I think that we're actually really powerful when we're coming together and responding. But I also want to see this trans response be starting to be led by trans people, because I think that that's something that's so often been forgotten in our community is, let's let someone else speak for us. Like our projects, our organizations, our resistance to this needs to actually be trans-led. And I see that now. I see the next, generation of trans community, like organising the rallies the other week, or, having action days on the Gold Coast, or speaking so powerfully to the media. And it's like now's a time where that's standard, because it hasn't been.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is the kind of, I think, a good place to start connecting some of the threads that we alluded to earlier in the show, which is around a point that you made right at the beginning, Necho, which is about the kind of erosion of agency, and how across this kind of targeting of young people in Queensland, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the agency and power of young people expressed in a whole bunch of different ways and in a bunch of different directions being constrained and repressed. And in the case of this current temporary ban on the medications, we're seeing the kind of repression of trans young people's ability to live flourishing, joyful lives. But we're also kind of trying to draw these threads to the persecution of young people that we've seen now over the last 5 years since set of reforms were announced into youth justice here in so-called Queensland, justice in inverted commas, and the kind of slow rolling back of the human rights of young people through successive state governments now, under the Labor government, and then now in more exaggerated form under the LNP after their election campaign last year was run almost entirely on a campaign of stopping youth crime. But I think there's these ways that those dynamics feel connected to me in terms of the way that young people expressing agency is threatening to the state. Thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. And I think that, stripping away people's agency is a really effective way of controlling them, especially, controlling the people that already have the least agency and, are subject to adult crime, adult time, because they have no money, they have no resources, they have no ability to live the life that they want and deserve to. And, and think when young people are bored, or when young people don't have food, or when young people have this completely normalized through their environment, then that's maybe a decision that they're going to make. And I think that, when we strip young people's ability to make decisions to build the future that they want, then of course we're going to see more people in our watch houses and prisons. We're going to see more people in prison because they can't access healthcare. And I always go back to, very early on when I started at Open Doors, a young trans woman said to me, and I said this at the rally the other day, is she said she didn't think that trans women got old. She thought that they were murdered or took their own life. And I think if that's a 15-year-old young person in this state that cannot see themselves, that has no future that they see for themselves, what are we all doing for the next generation? Because that's a collective responsibility that we all hold. And I think that, as we said earlier, what a testament that we're failing, that we have to have billboards all around this city that say, we're willing to lock up and cage a young person as young as 10 because we can't provide a future, we can't provide agency and safety and a community for this young person.
Yeah, the wonderful Gamilaroi Kumar, community organiser and prison abolitionist, a good friend of yours, Ruby Wharton, talks about the importance of being able to come to a place where we recognise the collective responsibility for young people in general. And I think what it means to understand that crime is not an individual failing, but a collective responsibility, that this thing that we call crime is collectively constructed, that I think even that is kind of useful to remind people sometimes. Like, we just decide collectively what is a crime and then we punish people for it. But that these are collective responsibilities. And
so is justice too. It's not something we want to throw out there. Justice is when a community is thriving, is working together, is, you know, moving towards a common goal and shared interest. It's not when we're valuing property over 10-year-old children.
Yeah, over
you know, to me,
people's
that's
lives.
not justice.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, we're going to come to this in just a little bit when we start talking about, I guess, the generative possibilities of connecting these struggles. But I think it also is important, and the example of the persecution of trans people in the kind of early years of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany is also really crucial, because it is a reminder that as long as anyone is being dehumanised, exploited, oppressed, subjugated, then the conditions are there for that to happen to any of us. And I think this is like maybe the part of the all of our struggles are connected that sometimes slips out, is it's like, well, no, if oppression is being normalised anywhere, it will spread, you know. It will become, it's so easy to normalise it. If we are allowing it to be normalised in any context, it's much harder to argue against it in others. For anyone who kind of hasn't been, I guess, following or has lost the thread a little bit on the youth crime transformations of the last few years, we basically saw the Human Rights Act repealed twice in order to pass legislation that violated the human rights of young people, including things like reversing the presumption of bail so that young people who were charged with certain crimes could be detained for longer, most notably in watch houses, meaning more young people were in detention whether or not they were pleading guilty, whether or not they had committed an offence. It also included criminal charges for technical breaches of bail, which is an absolutely appalling decision that the Labor government, before they introduced it, confidently said they would never introduce because it's a terrible thing to do, but which basically means that young people who are on bail and awaiting trial can receive additional criminal charges for breaching their bail conditions, even technical bail conditions, like not being able to take public transport, for example, or not being able to go to the CBD. Conditions that are incredibly difficult for people to comply with, which means that then when people go to trial for their charges, instead of a single criminal charge for the incident that they were initially charged for, they have multiple offences on their charge sheet, massively raising the likelihood of custodial sentences. So, Necho, I wanted to talk to you about this because, well, and one of the reasons I was excited to have this conversation with you particularly is because you're working at Open Doors now, but you're also a police and prison abolitionist, and you've been really involved in youth work with young people experiencing the violence of the criminal policing system. Can you talk a little bit about the impact you think these kind of tough on crime policies have had on young people in Queensland?
I think it's clear to say that they've been devastating, and that, you know, whether it's trans people who only ever go to isolation cells and watch houses, or, you know, have been led into rooms by, you know, prison officers and told that it's okay for, you know, 7 men to go in there and then to mock that woman because she's asked for, you know, new sheets and a new mattress. And this is, you know, young people in this state that are absolutely brutalised by prison and by police systems. You know, so I think that impacts, as you've clearly said, all young people that are, you know, policed in this way, and that this is not a new thing, but it's clearly getting worse.
Yeah. And it is worth, I feel like we really rabbit on about this, but it feels very important to also point out that much like the moral panic about trans young people, there is no youth crime crisis in Queensland. It is an entirely manufactured problem, right? There is no statistical increase in youth crime.
It's a decrease. Even you can go on, you know, if you have to go on QPS website, and they blast it on their website. They say down 18% since the 2013, 2014, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe I've got that slightly wrong, but it's down like 18%.
Yeah. There has been a steady decrease.
Yeah, they give you exact years that it's down from, and they give the exact percentage that youth crime is down from.
Yeah. So when we're having conversations about the youth crime crisis, we're having conversations about a media and politically manufactured idea of a youth crime crisis that is now being used to punish young people. And the place I wanted to, I guess, come back to in both of these conversations, because the part of the discussion about the announcement on puberty blockers that we haven't covered is that this is an announcement on blocking medications through the state system, right? So they can't block the prescription of these particular drugs to young people if they're going through private private clinics. Is that right?
That's what we understand now.
Yeah.
Yeah, as obviously things are changing rapidly and it's only been 3 weeks. But yeah, our understanding is that it's just through the state at the moment.
And so the reason I wanted to emphasise that is because it's, and much like the kind of youth crime stuff, I think what we're also seeing here is a state that is desperately trying to distract people from a cost of living and housing crisis, from the real crisis conditions of a state where people are struggling to meet their basic needs, and is trying to manage that through this kind of confected, creation of moral panics in all sorts of different directions, as though the reason that people can't afford their rent or buy groceries is because some teenagers, there's some grainy footage of some teenagers maybe stealing a car,
And I think what's so important to note here is that safety is important, right? Young children deserve to be safe, and so many votes are won on adult crime because it makes a community feel even less unsafe. But what's the core reason of that is because we don't know our neighbours. We don't know our community. We don't have trust. How can you build a relationship with your community? I think it's so important that we're acknowledging that people in this state don't have trust. Community safety is important. And I can understand that maybe there's people out there that don't have a strong sense of community that I'm sure so fortunate to have. And they think, God, those, young children I don't know, God, that trans person trying to access healthcare, this is unsafe. And that idea of unsafety is sold so effectively to people because there's no trust in relationships.
Yes. And I think that's such an important point, Necho, because I think that what it also helps us to do is to be like, those people, you're being sold a lie. You're being sold something that is not going to work. It's not going to create the kind of safety that you're yearning for and that you deserve, right? This is something that I think does feel really vital in these conversations. And you talked about the importance of recognising that all oppression is connected and that unless we free everyone, none of us will be truly free. And I wanted to ask what you think about why we need to understand that in this moment and see the kind of connections between all of these conjoined struggles.
I think it's, to answer that question correctly, it would be because everything that we've spoken about today is because, it's not just a loose or empty demand when we say that we need trans justice safety. What we know that means is housing, employment, education, joy, hope, brilliance that we all deserve, whether it's here, on this stolen land, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's anywhere in this world. It's just, these are not empty demands. And I think that, this justice that we're calling for, unless it applies to everyone, then we're really asking for nothing.
Absolutely.
And we're not asking for what we deserve.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think in a really practical sense, if we're demanding, justice and joy for trans kids, that means we have to abolish the youth criminal industrial complex because we're seeing trans kids victimised in those spaces.
And I think reading Rafayette Alaria this week and how 50 years before Israel physically colonized Palestine, they sold the idea of a Gaza that had no people and there was this empty land full of milk and honey. But when, people came to Gaza, they realized that actually there's Palestinian people living their life and ideas will be sold of the future. And what is the future that we're building for young people in this state or everywhere? Because we've all got that responsibility to, build a future where everyone's free and everyone lives. And I think that's what that none of us were free until we're all free means.
Thanks for joining us at Radio Reversal. Again, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan. For those that don't know you, do you mind just giving a quick self-introduction?
Who am I? I am a Wiradjuri person. I'm a professor in critical Indigenous studies at Macquarie University. And I do a whole lot of work on queer things. I'm trans non-binary and I work with you, actually. We're co-researchers.
Yeah. I'm extremely privileged to be working with Prof. O'Sullivan on a number of things, including one of the projects that you're working on is looking specifically at supports for parents of gender diverse Aboriginal kids, basically. So we might get into that a little bit in a minute, but I do want to just kind of like give the rundown of what this decision in the UK is and what it kind of says about the overall climate, and how that relates to some of the things that we've seen take place, for instance, here in Queensland, but also the kind of rhetoric that is pushing hard on getting some anti-trans legislation happening and really just denying rights to trans people in general. Yeah,
it's been a really rough time for a lot of people. One of the things about being trans, but also exploring gender complexity, is that a lot of it is focused on, we have to think about our relationship to the state a bit. Like, we have to think about what it means to travel, what it means to access services, and to suddenly have those cut off at a time when, especially I think for young people, when they're exploring it, working with their family, and sometimes their family supports them and sometimes they don't, but, trying to understand what support is provided at the same time as it being kind of yanked away. And of course, fundamentally, it also sends a message to young people that they don't belong. And it's a terrible message to send to any person, let alone young people. And so it's very worrying to see it. So what's happening in Queensland is really alarming. It's very similar to what's happened in the US, which is really began quite a long time ago, but started to take a bit of shape in early 2023 when a lot of states started to introduce some mechanisms that were really about restricting access to healthcare. And, we connect with a fantastic children's hospital, Odessa Brown, in Seattle, Washington, has focused very centrally on the idea that all care is important for young people, and that in particular for trans and gender diverse kids, that gender affirming care is healthcare. And this they've just taken a court case, obviously since President Trump came in. We've seen a very targeted attacks on trans and gender diverse people, and young people, because they don't have majority, are often the targets, and their families are the targets as well. And so what we've seen is healthcare that has been ongoing being withdrawn at a which is obviously both dangerous and desperately problematic, because that should be defined by healthcare systems. Here in so-called Australia, we have the Australian Medical Association, we have the two major nursing associations, a number of different medical associations across the country, all the major ones, have supported gender affirming care, and have really said this is about the relationship that you have with your healthcare provider, and that these decisions shouldn't be made outside of that relationship, in other words, by the state. And so what we're seeing happening in the US goes beyond healthcare. It goes into right to travel, not just for people like us that can't get visas or ESTAs to get into the US, but for others who are living there who have been denied passports in any gender, who are trans, because of the apparent confusion of how they're presenting. And so these are about the withdrawal of human rights. And so obviously what's happened in the UK, where it has this enormous impact on human rights, because a decision was made by a few judges who only heard one side of an argument and effectively ruled a very, very conflicting set of statements that still allow for trans women in particular, but this is intended to be for others as well, to still access services, but to have some of those services be withheld. And what was really fascinating about it is the Prime Minister, Starmer, actually released a statement saying he was very pleased that this provided great clarity. So, what it doesn't is provide clarity. We've had over the last couple of days, they've had enough time to read this, and we've had the Labor government there come out very strongly in support of this finding. But we've also had all of these QCs talk about taking this to human rights, to the European Court of Human Rights. And it would surprise me if it wasn't successful. Only, the challenge, only because it's so inconsistent to have a case that's made on the basis of both conflicting legislative principles, where there is a right under the UK Act for trans women to be considered women, and at the same time there are these ideas of sex-based rights, and so where we'll see it play out probably is in case law, which is very frustrating to see. I'm very concerned about that, but I also suspect that this will be taken earlier to human rights. And and it's frustrating because there were opportunities all the way to read the research that's been done, to understand about the relationship between patients and healthcare professionals, and to really talk to people who are, deeply involved in this work. And of course, more importantly, people who are affected by this. So the real risk is being able to be out there in the public. It's the risk is not being able to go to the toilet.
Totally. There's so much made of the kind of bathroom situation. And I think in Australia we can sometimes forget because there's quite often a unisex disabled toilet. Not always, but it's certainly more frequently available here than it is in some other countries. So in the US, usually those are contained within the binary gender divided toilet systems. And so while there's, I have seen some, turf apologists kind of posting things online that say, well, there's often a unisex option, but there's not actually always a unisex option.
No, I think we saw a lot when we were travelling that these were not available to us at all. We had to make a binary gender decision. And, this... so these are...
And when you're making these decisions, it's not just about what feels right. It's about actual safety and,
And I know there's been a lot made of this issue of people going, to cis people, people who are not trans are going into some of these places and also being questioned in relation to their gender. First of all, absolutely that's going to happen. It always has. It's just that people are feeling emboldened by the idea that they're in the right. And they're being emboldened by the media, by the government, and also by this whole idea of fear that's trotted out. And the reality is that, men, if this is the concern about men, not trans women, but men going into women's toilets, they've always been able to do that. This is, they do it all the time. This is, if somebody wants to be a bad actor, they're just going to do it. So, it is in its own way a nonsense. And so, part of it is really understanding that, but also this is scapegoating. This is just trying to find a group that has been weakened by the erosion of these laws, but also because they do exist, but also, these restrictions being put in place make them feel better about the idea that they've scapegoated this group. It's really terrible. And this can't be the world that we give to young people, I'm so worried about that. So the work we're doing with parents of gender diverse kids, we're just coming to the end of a report that's based on, we asked a whole lot of people, and it was two groups of people, older trans and gender diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to tell us what they wish had been around when they were younger, what they wish they knew, and how they they wished those resources were made available. And then we asked the same thing of parents and caregivers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids to talk to their kids and to share with us some of this. And they came up with some things that are different than we would have heard with people who are not Indigenous. A lot of stuff around, won't surprise anyone hearing this, that a lot of stuff around is it cultural, to be trans and gender diverse. And, so we knew that we had to explain a little about that, to talk about that. We use, as we use, business. If we exist now, we existed in the past and we exist in the future. This idea that we're not, as people made up, where we've consistently always been here. Have we always been allowed to be here in every culture across every timeline, particularly kind of colonial timelines? No, but that doesn't mean that we didn't exist, And so part of this is really understanding that our communities just want to provide support. They're not trying to exclude people. There's not anybody at a Aboriginal Controlled Health Service saying, go away. This is around understanding what needs to happen. And so these resources are, working towards that, guiding some of those resources, but also some of this reporting so that people can know what folks have thought about this, so that they can gather those resources if they work in one of these sites, but also to remind young people that, they have a right to be here. In spite of anything else that's happening.
Yeah, and especially in the current climate and these, the way that these quote unquote debates are playing out in a kind of public sphere, it's making a sport out of people's lives, that it's being put to the use of essentially very conservative agendas. And that's kind of the root of the binary genders, the binary sex gender system has this root in white supremacy and in kind of the proof of a superior race. So, these are things that we absolutely, don't abide by anymore. So the fact that there's now this kind of separating out of that sex gender system and races as something that we go, oh, well, that's over here, and we don't see that as scientifically valid in the way that it used to be considered by 19th century race scientists and eugenicists. But this is still valid. I mean, I did want to just sort of bring in, I've got a couple of quotes here from a biologist. I know that this is and I want to say, I think leaning on these arguments and kind of making them in a public sphere is not necessarily helpful, but I think it can be helpful for us as trans people to remind ourselves that we're not pushing against some kind of biology, that this is actually how the real world kind of exists. So that I did just want to kind of bring this. So this is a recent book by an ornithologist, Richard O'Prum, and evolutionary biologist called Performance All the Way Down. It's from 2023. And he really he goes through all of the different scientific markers of individual sex characteristics, what are called that under sort of scientific language. And he says, this is a quote, "A commitment to the existence of a binary fact of individual sex cannot be scientifically justified by reference to genes, genomes, chromosomes, hormone levels, gene expression profiles, or any other such data. And such a commitment should be considered a cultural idea, not a justifiable scientific judgment. Yeah. Attempts to define individual sex scientifically fail and will continue to fail because each of the mechanistic inputs to the process of the embodiment of sex is simply one of the multiple hierarchically networked biological agencies involved in the realization of an individual's reproductive possibilities." So even at this level of, we separate out quite often the idea of sex and gender, but even at this level of quote unquote biological sex, yeah. The ways of, and we've seen this especially in sporting events, the ways of determining whether one is exactly one or the other of this binary is actually really fraught and tangential. And he describes it as much more kind of system of, he uses the performative theory of gender from Judith Butler to really talk about how it's something that the agency of cells over a long time, and including neural cells, so including preference, formulate in order to kind of create a body that presents in a particular sexual or gender fashion. So he goes into a lot of detail with this, and it gets very heady, but essentially saying that it's just not, this kind of idea of like biologically woman is just not scientifically defendable. It's always more complex. And I think that so much of essentially what's leaning more towards fascism and authoritarianism tries to simplify everything and laugh away at complexity. But the truth is that we're all extremely complex beings, and we're in these complex systems of relationship. And the more that we try to deny and push away that, and kind of fit into these rigidities and conformities of categories that are then deemed acceptable or not acceptable, the more problematic that becomes on so many levels, but it certainly is unscientific. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that in. Yeah.
It is brilliant, and it's brilliant analysis and connection back from you as well. This is the fundamental problem, that it requires an enormous amount of policing.
Indeed.
It requires constant observation of individuals. It requires a colonial structure that is about people being contained and others doing the containing. And I think this has been what's appealing to a lot of people who felt that they didn't have the rights they were promised. That was one of the things that we'd heard from Campbell X when we were talking to them just recently, and in a very powerful conversation. But this whole idea of it being able to be clearly understood has been so desired that you have people like Starmer coming up with, oh, thank heavens, we now know,
Yeah.
And that
someone's nailed it down finally. This is what a woman
exactly.
is.
Exactly. This whole notion of the toilet stuff is really interesting to me, because my PhD focused on this. My PhD was focused on the whole idea of not being able to go into variously gendered toilets because you would be hounded out, because that's what used to happen to me. And it wasn't even hounded out. Occasionally it was, but for the most part it was discomfort. And there is this notion that discomfort is impossible. And I think about, Ellen Van Even's work, Swim, that talks about the discomfort of getting all of your gear off in public baths, the change area of public baths. And I always felt uncomfortable about that because of my relationship to my body. But others didn't. And there was a lot of bullying about, you have to be able to get all of your gear off. If you can't get all of your gear off, you've got something wrong with you. And it's kind of, none of your business. But also this speaks to a lot of this, but people are going to have to take all of their clothes. It's actually not what younger people are doing now. And also it's missing a lot of points about how, the complexity of culture.
Absolutely. Also the privilege of not having the intrusive kind of processes of police strip searches, generally applied to your racial presentation and gender presentation. So yeah,
totally. It is at an essential level privileged, but it's also functionally problematic. It's dealing with this idea that you can somehow be in the world and be and that you should be able to be in the world and be everything that you want to be instead of negotiating that. And so the whole thing is that we negotiate it all the time, actually, because most people leave their house every day with clothes on, and they negotiate what that looks like. I'm not making a case that everybody should wear clothes. I don't really care. But that is the negotiated relationship to the outside-inside world, and it's really failing to understand that beyond that, you don't get to say what clothes those are. You don't get to say, you can't go out in a dress because I said so. And obviously for a lot of these people, they want to be able to say that. That is their background kind of understanding of the world, is that they have done this, have said this, it's worked or not. And as a result, they want to kind of reproduce it writ large. I'm just going to say, if it didn't work on your kids, it's probably not going to work on someone else's kids. But, fair go, except it's not a fair go. It's impinging on the human rights of other people, because while that person never has to think about the clothes that they're wearing, they've forced another person to do it. This, at a really fundamental level, is terrible. It's, of course, from a biological sex perspective, there is this enormous complexity. And too many people kind of use as an example people with, who are intersex as an example of this. But even when you look at folks who are intersex, the ways that has changed in terms of our understanding of it in the last 10 years has been enormous. And part of those changes have been to stop medicalising and pathologizing, more significantly, what it is to have intersex characteristics, and to start to have a discussion about what constitutes. And so both of those become incredibly important as points of dismissal as well. They matter to individuals because they may seek treatment, they may seek understanding, they may seek some knowledge that they didn't otherwise have. They may have to resist a whole lot of interventions. They may have not been able to resist interventions because they were children, and they may have to deal with the outcomes of that. There are all of these things. So utilising people in that way, I feel really uncomfortable about it. Instead, I think it's about saying there just is complexity. I had the experience recently of a health service asking me how they should deal with this in terms of their notation as they were doing patient intake. And there's two ways. And luckily we have the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and we have our OzPath version of the Australian Professional Association for Transgender Health to provide some of these resources. But really significantly, it's about having a conversation with the patient, but it's also really importantly, if you go back to something like biological sex and you say, I'm just going to treat this person through their biological sex, and they've either through taking hormones or through sport or any other, or living in walls,
or even, cisgendered people can have hormonal imbalances and things like this. This is something that there's treatment for all of the time. Of course. Yeah.
So if you're a trans woman who is forced to say male and you're an older person, the potential for having osteoporosis is a lot higher. And, it's not capturing those common questions that a doctor might have if that's not there. So the argument is the more information individually that can be shared, the better about this. Where it's necessary, because we also find with patient intakes that other people, dentists and others, are kind of asking these questions where it's not necessary, where for a range of reasons it's not necessary to know that. And, there are restrictions. Medicare has blood work restrictions that are binary gendered. And so you have to pay if you're getting some, if you're the other gender based on that. And so it has all of these, this complexity around it that's suddenly made less complex when it's just dealing with a person, when it's just having that relationship with a person, which at any intake happens anyway. There's always an interaction in that way. It's not creating more work. Creating less.
Well, and that's something in Prom's book. He's really arguing that incorporating more queer theory into biology make for better science, and in large part because it considers the complexity of individuals, and it stops applying these categories without really questioning them in ways that actually end up really influencing the results of any kind of study and leaving out large sections of the population or even small sections of populations like that are not irrelevant.
A lot of small sections make a large section.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So and often are a problem to deal with then. So they create more work. This stuff is about creating less work or making things simpler, but again, their argument is that it doesn't. And that sounds fantastic. I can't wait to read it. And, I think this is a really, a powerful statement, but it was really telling to hear Starmer talk about the relief. I think it reflects where a lot of people are at. They just don't want to have to think about this.
Yeah.
And the thing is that for the most part, they don't need to, but they do when someone's rights are being taken away. It was very disturbing to hear a Prime Minister feel relief at the idea of someone's rights being removed.
Yeah. And I think that kind of like relief about like, oh, this is simpler now. I read a recent article from Sophie Lewis on this UK decision, and she writes about enemy feminisms quite a lot. She's got a book that's coming out shortly, I believe. But she also borrows a term from the historian Anne Stoller, who writes about colonial common sense, this kind of idea of what common sense is, which is also policed, that is still about upholding the rigid systems of what you call the colonial system of gender and everything else. that this is really, it's part of a tool of control, and this idea of what common sense is, that's not innate. That's something that is reinforced constantly to kind of make it seem like that's the simple approach, that's the root of people's thinking. Yeah.
I think there's, obviously what we've seen with Queensland is that for people who don't know, there was a change to make it easier to be able to change your gender markers. It meant that you didn't have to have surgery, and that it was more expansive in how it provided gender marker changes on things like birth certificates, just state-based paperwork, basically. And this feels like a next government coming in, a more conservative one, having a reaction to that.
Yeah.
That's what it feels like. And I don't think it's a surprise that the reaction happens around the same time as there are all these other reactions happening around the world. I'd love to see, Australia in its current form, complex, messy, problematic as it is, to take some kind of leadership role on this.
Yeah.
And to follow healthcare professionals that we otherwise follow, that the government otherwise follows, and to really lead research on the outcomes of this. We don't know things like numbers. We don't know who's accessing healthcare. We don't know this, and we should. And the reason that we don't know this is that we don't take complex enough notes in this process. And again, it's never a downside to do that. This is, I would argue, not costly. This is cost effective. This stops a whole lot of unnecessary inquiries and reshifts to the idea of human rights being essential, and that it should centre in good healthcare.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Prof, for talking with me today. I'm sure we will get you on again soon to keep talking about the struggle and the work that trans activists and thinkers and scholars are doing to change the potential futures of this as it unfolds here as well. And also recognizing, I think there's this idea of liberal progress that sees it unfolding in this linear fashion, and it's really showing every win can be lost very much and very quickly. Yeah,
I think that's what's been incredibly shocking to people, to be honest. And I think Trump coming in and changing a lot of these narratives has reminded people that progress is not some permanent idea.
And it needs to be defended.
Yeah, that's right. And also maybe it's not progress for everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, again, as always, I just learn a lot from talking to you. Thanks.
Oh, likewise. Thanks, Prof.